what is it that we even mean by the term civil liberties? What is it that that denotes? And the reason I think that's so important is because it's a term that gets tossed around a lot. You hear politicians of all stripes all the time invoking this concept. It's pretty much a cliche at this point. Nobody debates civil liberties. No one ever stands up and says, I just want you to know that my position on civil liberties is that I'm against it. It's something that is just a slogan designed to justify whatever anyone wants to justify. And so it's important to really understand the definition of what this term is. And the good thing about that endeavor, about understanding what the term civil liberties actually is that it is not a very complicated concept. It's actually fairly straightforward. When we describe civil liberties or talk about defending our core liberties or our constitutional rights, all we really are referring to is the list of prohibitions, the list of limitations that we have imposed on the government regarding how they can exercise their power against us. It is a list that we've imposed on them and said, you can never cross these lines if we're to accept the assertion of your authority as legitimate and valid. And the good thing, the further good thing about that endeavor, about understanding what the term civil liberties means, is that we don't have to go out on a sort of scavenger hunt in search of this list of limitations that we've imposed on the government's power. That list is found, it has been assembled all in one place, which is called the Constitution or the Bill of Rights. And the best thing about this endeavor, about understanding what civil liberties means, is that this list of prohibitions, the limitations that we've imposed on the state, are not ambiguous or muddled, nor are they circumstantial or conditional. They don't apply only in times of peace or whenever it can't be demonstrated that national security would be aided by their violation. They are clear and absolute and unconditional. And the way that you know that is simply by looking at the list and seeing what it says. So if you look at the First Amendment, it says, Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. If you look at the Fourth Amendment, it says nobody shall be subjected to unreasonable searches and seizures without a probable cause warrant, a warrant issued upon a finding of probable cause. If you look at the Fifth Amendment, it says no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property. No person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. They are absolute in their expressions. They're unconditional in their application. I once had this fairly acrimonious exchange with Joe Klein of Time Magazine. I've actually had many acrimonious exchanges with Joe Klein of Time Magazine, but this one in particular that I think took place in 2008 or 2009, and it was an argument about civil liberties. I don't recall the specifics, but it went on for a couple of weeks, and it became very kind of confrontational, and it involved the exchange of lots of accusatory statements. And in the middle of it, he wrote something and said, I think what's driving all of this, the key thing to realize about why this dispute has arisen is that Glenn Greenwald is a civil liberties extremist. And honestly, what happened was when I read that statement by him, I was actually really bewildered because I thought to myself, you know, I don't understand this. We're having this extremely vituperative exchange. We're saying all sorts of horrible things about each other, and all of a sudden in the middle, he just stopped and decided to lavish this incredible praise on me. Like, I'm a civil liberties extremist. And it took me a few minutes, and I realized, oh wait, actually no, when he says that, he actually means that that's like a bad thing. And the reason that was so confusing to me was because civil liberties extremist is in essence the greatest compliment that someone can pay you. And the reason I say that is because there is no way to defend liberties without being extreme about it. There is no way to express fealty to these rights that I just described without insisting upon their application to everyone equally and in all circumstances. The minute you start justifying pragmatic waivers of them or exceptions to be made for pragmatic considerations is the minute that you cease to believe in them. And what I think is so critical about this concept of civil liberties and the specific expressions of it that it finds in our Bill of Rights, in our Constitution, is that if you look at the state of the United States, and you've heard about this all day, including from Professor Aziz just now, what you find are not isolated case-by-case violations of them. What you find are fundamental and systematic repudiations of these rights. So if you look at the history over the last decade of the way in which American Muslims have been prosecuted for, quote, material support for terrorism, what you find is that they've been targeted and prosecuted based not on acts that they've undertaken, but on beliefs that they have expressed. If you look at the sprawling surveillance state that has been erected, in which all of our activities are monitored and reported and stored in government databases without any indication that we've done anything wrong, let alone as showing a probable cause that we have, it is as complete and pure a violation of the Fourth Amendment as it gets. And if you look at the system of indefinite detention, of putting people in cages, often for life, without even a pretense of any charge, or what we have now, which is targeting people, including American citizens, for execution, for extrajudicial assassination, in total secrecy, without charges, oversight of any kind, that is as profound and complete a repudiation of the Fifth Amendment's guarantee against the deprivation of life or liberty without due process of law. This is a systematic violation of these liberties, not isolated case-by-case basis. And what's most striking about it to me is that as we move further away from the precipitating pretext, which is the attack of 9/11, what one finds is that these violations become more acute. They continue to increase rather than recede. And so what I want to do is just spend a few minutes asking two questions about this state of affairs. One of which is, why has this happened? Why has it been allowed to happen with relatively little backlash and resistance of the type that we've convened here today to generate? And secondly, what are the primary implications of allowing these sorts of abuses to continue in such a fundamental way for as long as we've allowed them to continue? And the reason I think those two questions are so crucial is because only by understanding what causes it and understanding why it's so crucial to stop it can we ourselves begin to think about how to create strategies for arresting it and convincing our fellow citizens to join us in that effort. So let me begin with that first question, which is, why has this all happened? Why have we allowed this to happen? And I think there are a few reasons why this has taken place and why it's been so difficult to combat it. What are the impediments? The first of which is that all of this is taking place in the context of war. And not just a war against a specific country, but a war against multiple countries on the planet. The reason that's so significant is because it is always the case, historically in every society it is the case, that in times of war, that is when the power of political leaders is most unconstrained. 2,000 years ago, Cicero said, when men pick up arms, the law falls mute. There are no limits, or very few limits, that can be effectively applied to political leaders when they're prosecuting and waging a war. That was why it was supposed to be so difficult under the Constitution for wars to be commenced, because of the threat that they pose to our core liberties. And what's most amazing about the quote-unquote war which we're currently fighting is that unlike prior wars in American history that have justified civil liberties abuses, which ended when those wars ended, so Abraham Lincoln's suspension of habeas corpus ended when the Civil War did. Franklin Roosevelt's internment of Japanese Americans, they were liberated once World War II was over. This war, by design, can have no end. It is designed to be an internal and permanent war. Just 2 weeks ago, the Washington Post reported that the Obama administration is in the process of codifying its quote-unquote kill lists by creating what the administration is calling a disposition matrix. A matrix that analyzes algorithms to determine how you should be disposed of. Should you be put into prison indefinitely without charges? Should you be killed? Should you be charged with a crime? And the premise of this system, said the Washington Post, was that Obama administration officials are acting on the premise that the quote-unquote war on terror will take place for at least another decade, which means that it will have lasted longer than 20 years. And when you talk about a war that lasts for 20 years, you're no longer talking about a finite, discrete event that ushers in civil liberties abridgments that end when the war is due. You're talking about a fundamental and radical transformation of the kind of government we have. The other aspect of war that makes it so difficult to combat civil liberties abridgments is that one of the crucial strategies of war on the part of every government is to dehumanize the group against whom violence is being applied. And the reason that's so crucial is because no population, other than the most sociopathic, would tolerate years and years and years of continuous lethal force applied to a foreign population unless the humanity of that population has been obscured and hidden and denied, unless they become dehumanized. And this war has involved the lethal application of force against almost exclusively one group of people, which are Muslims. And although the government and its officials will explicitly say that we're not at war against Muslims generally or against Islam, the theory, which is that every time the US government imprisons somebody without charges or kills somebody, that it should be assumed, without evidence being presented, without due process being afforded, that those people somehow deserve it, that they're militants or terrorists or whatever other labels the government and the media slap upon them reflexively. The theory has created the idea in the minds of the population by design that this group of people, American Muslims, or Muslims generally, are collectively guilty, that they're really not human in the way that we would object if any other group of human beings were being treated in this manner. And this dual approach of war, heightening the power of political leaders, at the same time dehumanizing the group which is targeted, makes it very difficult to combat rights abridgments because of the idea that anything the government does in its name is probably justified. The second reason why this is so difficult to combat and why this has been allowed to happen is related to the first. Professor Aziz talked a lot about this, other speakers today have as well, so I'm just going to touch upon it. It is the idea that because these abuses are only happening to one small marginalized group of people, that there really is no reason for most other people to be concerned about it, that you can be indifferent to it or even supportive of it. And I think, it's easy to mock that idea. It's easy to condemn other people for thinking that because these rights abuses aren't affecting them, that they can somehow forget about it or be even supportive of it. But I think it's important to recognize just how potent of a strategy that is, how it can affect all of us, including people who are otherwise sympathetic to these issues. So I know lots of people who will read the things I write, who read about these injustices, who will say, look, I agree with you, these things are horrible, but deep in their minds, they know that when they wake up tomorrow morning, because they're not Muslim, because they're white, that it is extremely unlikely that they're going to be abducted and taken to Guantanamo or put in a cage without charges. They know it's extremely unlikely that a drone will be sent over their house with a cruise missile launch that blows up their house and their children. So it's very easy to deprioritize these issues, even if we think they're injustices, and to believe that they don't really require as much urgency as others that might affect us more directly. And aside from the obvious moral reason that I think nobody in this room needs to know, the sign, the motto of the conference is, an injury to one is an injury to all, aside from that moral precept, which is incredibly compelling, it is the case that it is just incredibly misguided to think in that way from a practical or pragmatic standpoint, because it is always the case, not sometimes, not usually, but always the case, that civil liberties abridgments, abuses of core rights, extend beyond their original application to all sorts of unanticipated groups. And you can look at the history of the Patriot Act over the last 10 years, which has been applied overwhelmingly in 85% of the cases to matters having nothing to do with terrorism. Or you look at the FBI strategy of creating their own plots and financing their own plots and luring people into their own plots, and then at the last minute heroically breaking up their own plots, and then announcing to the world how grateful we should be that they've kept us safe and yet again broken up their own plot. That tactic is now being applied to anarchist activists, to people protesting NATO policies, to, as Professor Aziz said, to the Occupy movement. And what we've seen most of all, and I think most perniciously of all, is the importation of war on terror tactics from what was once confined to foreign soil into domestic soil. So if you listen to US national security officials who 10 years ago and 8 years ago and even 5 years ago were saying that the greatest threat to American national security was Al-Qaeda, what they now say is that the greatest threat to national security are what they call, quote, homegrown terrorists. And so you see the civil liberties abuses of the last several years being directed not outward to foreign nationals, but inward domestically to American citizens. That's what the dilution of Miranda rights are about for people taken in on and arrested on US soil. It's what the NDAA is designed to do, which is to codify the power of indefinite detention on US soil. It's what the paramilitarization of our local and state police forces based on tactics perfected in Baghdad, is designed to do. It's what the increasingly rapid importation of drones is all about.